Hi there, I'm Vicki PARFENOW. I'm glad you're here. Have you ever tried stamping on Kraft and found it really hard to get a clean, crisp image? Well, in my last video, I showed you how to get a nice, clean image on these Kraft cards using a stamp positioner so that you could restamp if it wasn't quite dark enough or the words were a little bit unclear. So that gives you nice, clear stamping. And I've been making some more wallets. So I have a video tutorial on how to make these. So that's easy note card wallet video, I think. But I am going to use these Kraft note cards from the Kraft note cards and envelopes box and some VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a pigment ink for fine details. I also have this gorgeous stamp, which I think I showed you earlier, from craftyindividuals.co.uk. It has such fine detail in it. The writing underneath says, "Meet under the tree for a nice cup of tea." So I'm going to get the stamp out, and you can see that it is a very thin stamp. Now, there are ways to attach this to your stamping platform, and I'm going to explain that to you now. So if you were to lift that off, it doesn't cling. It's just rubber. It's very thin, so it will need your stamping mat underneath, but it will also need a way to be attached to the door of your stamp positioner. So the method I recommend is double-sided tape. I like to use Express-It double-sided tape. It's one of my favourites. It's made in Australia and it tears quite nicely. So I'm just going to put 3 strips along the back, and will get it attached to my stamping positioner. So some of the frustrations that I think you'll find when you're trying to stamp on Kraft is that it doesn't absorb the ink as well as smooth cardstock. If you look at Kraft cardstock, it has rather a rough finish. It doesn't have that sleek, smooth finish of regular card, so you do have to put a bit more effort in to getting a nice, crisp image. Now, I have my block firmly positioned on the door. You can see I'm using my Speedball Baren there as a stamp glider, and the VersaFine Black Onyx ink. So I'm going to ink up. And one of the things I always recommend when you're using any kind of ink is that you put the lid on straight away so you don't accidentally put your fingers in it or put your equipment in it. Don't ask me how I know that. I know it for sure. I've done it many times myself. Okay, so I'm using my red Baren, which is a Speedball Baren, as a stamp glider or chucky tool. Now I can see there are some spaces here in the writing underneath that didn't quite stamp. So I'm going to ink up again and restamp and focus on the middle of that line and the middle of the tree. And I'm going to pop my stamp picture from the case underneath so I can figure out exactly where I need to put that pressure. Now, even doing it this way doesn't always work, and I'll show you how this didn't quite work for me, because the image of "Meet under the tree for a nice cup of tea," the little writing underneath, started to get quite blurred. So you can see, and there's no fixing this. I can't get a white gel pen because this is Kraft paper and it would really show up. So what to do? Okay, so here's the fix. I'm going to use that as the inside of the card, just making sure the ink's dry so it doesn't transfer onto my foam mat there. And I'm going to try again. So I'm going to have another stab at it. And this time I'm getting some of the ink off first. You can see that I didn't re-ink. I'm actually discharging some of that ink back onto the card so that if it was starting to get a little bit over-inked, that problem has been addressed. So back to the drawing board, and this happens with stamping on Kraft. You have to be prepared that sometimes it's just not going to work out the way you want. But I did manage to get this to work, and I'll show you how I did it. So you can see I'm rubbing over all areas of the stamp. Having that image right next to me of the stamp case is really helpful because I can just see if there are little parts missing or not. And I'm just tapping lightly this time. Just tap, tap really lightly so that I'm not placing too much ink on there that's going to smoosh out and spoil the finished result. Paying extra attention to the pieces that just need a little more. Just again, it seems to be the center of those words and the center of the tree. So I'm just going to ink up that section of the tree. So you can adjust the amount of ink you're putting onto your stamp and get a really successful image. Tiny bits left, but I'm getting there, and this is a much better, crisper image than the first one was. There we go. It has finally worked. Okay, that is looking really clear, really beautiful, fine details there. The camera is just a bit blurry, but in real life that is very crisp and clear. Look at all those fine details. Isn't that the most gorgeous stamp? It's really pretty. Okay, now I have something inside the card that I need to cover up. So there's always a fix. So the easiest way to cover this up is with some vanilla or cream cardstock, which goes beautifully with the Kraft. And this is going to be the layering piece inside the card where I can write the message. And it also makes it easier to write the message on this smooth cardstock than on the Kraft card, which is kind of rough. So you can see I'm not measuring, I'm just using the card as a template. And you can see it just has a little bit of edge all around the side. And so all I need to do now is get some tape runner. Again, I'm using Express It tape runner. You can get these in all kinds of different brands, but I do like this tape runner. It seems to work really well. And some tape on the back. And the problem of this card has now been solved. It has a perfectly stamped image on the front and a layering piece on the inside to cover up where it got too deeply inked. And I'm just going to use my bone folder so that it will open in the opposite direction. There's a teeny tiny bit that didn't quite stamp. Honestly, I don't know that I even needed to fix this, but I did have my Uniball Vision Elite pen, which is like a biro or rollerball pen, right next to me. So I thought, why not just pop a few little parts of ink over the tiny image so it is completely perfect. There's the spot inside for writing your message and the envelope ready to go. Okay, now I have another stamp here which is so finely detailed. It was one of the most finely detailed stamps I could find, and I thought, well, this will be a good test to get super fine details, not just on Kraft card, but on watercolor card. Now I'm really setting a challenge for myself here. So this stamp is from Darkroom Door. It's a photo stamp, and this is an Australian company, and Rachel Gregg is the photographer who takes these wonderful photos. Now I'm going to set it up on my stamping positioner. It's a thicker rubber, so it doesn't need the mat. I'm going to put my Kraft cardstock on here. And on the back of this, there is some paper that peels off, and you end up with something that will actually cling to either an acrylic block or a stamp positioner. So this one you won't need to put double-sided tape on. You can close the door, pick up the stamp, and it's all very simple. Coming back in with the VersaFine Onyx Black. And I'm rubbing quite a bit of ink on it first, but then I'm tapping off, tap, because if you just rub it across, you might get sort of swiped lines on your inking, which you don't want. So tapping off to finish. And let's see how this very first impression comes out on the Kraft cardstock. Again, use a stamp glider, or in this case, my Speedball Red Baren. Press it with your fingers. And see how this looks. That's a pretty nice impression, actually. That's nice. I'm liking that. Just a little bits, again, around the edges, in the middle particularly. So again, back to inking it up. And this looks absolutely gorgeous on Kraft card with the black ink and this beautiful image, which is so photoreal. It's absolutely lovely. It is a scene from Amsterdam, and when I saw this stamp, I just had to have it. It was so evocative of a trip I did to Amsterdam a long time ago, and just seeing the beautiful bicycle and the canal. Oh, so gorgeous. So this doesn't require a huge amount of pressure. It just needs a little bit more ink here or there. And it's done. Now you can see how nicely that's inked, and doesn't it look great on the Kraft card? So Kraft card really does have its uses, I think, particularly for a stamp like this. That's really beautiful. I'm very pleased with how that's stamped. So this stamp is called Bicycle. Okay, now I'm going to go in with this Daler Rowney watercolour postcards paper. It's very thick. It's 300 GSM, and it is also very textured. Now, this is a real challenge to stamp on with any kind of stamp, but I am going to face the challenge, and I'm going to stamp this bicycle image on watercolour, thick watercolour textured card, and see how we go. And you might be saying, well, why do you want to go to all this trouble to put it onto watercolour card? Well, that's because I want to paint into the background with my watercolour paints. Now I'm bringing in a Tim Holtz Distress Sprayer, and I'm spraying it from a height with a fine mist, not too much water, just a couple of spritzes. And you can see it is starting to shine. So I don't want any shine on that. I'm going to blot any bits that are shiny. And you can see it's starting to curl. It's starting to curl away from the base. So something that really helps your card flatten out again is to turn it over and spray the back in the same fashion. So I'm just going to give it a couple of spritzes on the back and turn it back over again. And that has flattened out the card considerably. Now, I don't want all that water sitting there, so I'm blotting it with a paper towel. All I'm doing is getting the paper damp. And as a printmaker, when I'm running a print in the printing studio, I will often soak the paper and then blot it dry. In this case, the paper just needs a light spritzing and a paper towel to blot up any excess. And this will help the ink, just as I'm doing here, the same thing with the red Baren. This will help the ink absorb into the paper. And that first image is quite light, but still quite crisp. I can actually see quite a lot of detail in there. So this will take quite a bit of ink. Now, another thing about printmaking is that often if you're using a stamp or a block, perhaps a lino block that you've carved, or a block that hasn't ever been inked before and it's the very first time it's been inked, you need for the block to season. So often the ghost print is actually a better print than the first print that you run on the printing press. And it's the same even if you have, say, for instance, a jelly plate or a gel press. You'll often find that the second print, the ghost print, prints much better than the first. And it's because the plate has been seasoned. So this is a brand new stamp. This is the first time I've used this stamp. And it needs a couple of inking sessions, like I'm doing right here, to really season the block to take the ink. It's a really stunning stamp, and it's well worth the effort of inking up over and over, and particularly because it is coarse watercolour paper. I really set myself a challenge with this, but I am determined to use this as a beautiful painted piece using my watercolours to colour it. Okay, let's see. I think we're getting close. Just a little bit in the centre, and if you see here, you can see it's quite dark here, and I think this is probably going to be my last pass. It has a beautiful texture now that I'm looking at it. It has that bumpy texture that shows through on watercolour paper, and I can still quite clearly see the image of the bicycle, the image of the canal, and the houses behind it. And it's looking really, really interesting. Look how nice that is. Isn't that just gorgeous? And the colours, wow, it's just divine. I love it. So that is a really difficult paper to stamp on. So I'm going to show you the same image just on a smooth cream cardstock. And I'm going to, without inking it up, I'm going to use some of that ink. I don't want to keep putting ink over and over if I haven't applied it to the card. So there's a lot of ink still on that stamp, as you can see. And now I'm just going to press it down. Give it some love with the stamp glider. And you can see how nice that stamps. It's beautifully stamped. Just one more pass and we're going to have a really clear, crisp image on that smooth cream cardstock. This has to be one of my all-time favourite stamps. You know, I think it's so artsy. It's really interesting. It's something that doesn't need any kind of a greeting over the top of it. You can put the greeting on the inside of your card with these. And this is my kind of stamping, what I really love to do. Very artistic, very cool. And I love these darkroom door stamps. They also do fabulous quote stamps for inside your cards. Now I'm just going to straighten this out with my paper trimmer. I'm just testing to make sure the ink's dry so I don't blot any ink onto my finished piece because it is beautiful. And I'm just trimming it down. Now it was a little bit crooked on this paper, so I'm going to, you can see how I'm pushing the edge of that paper down a little bit. It's not completely lined up because I'm trying to get the lines parallel. So that's a nice parallel line there. And you can see there's a nice squared corner there now. So all I need to do is trim off the final edge. So if you have stamped something slightly crooked, you can often correct it this way too. You can see those two little pieces that I've taken off. So here are the pieces. Aren't they just gorgeous? The cream cardstock, the watercolour paper, the Kraft cardstock, and the Kraft cardstock for the little tree. So persevere with Kraft card. It's well worth it. It gives a beautiful result, particularly with these sorts of stamps. I just thought they were the perfect stamps for using on Kraft. I hope that's given you lots of helpful tips and hints today. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye for now.